I'm Jem Fadling, and today I'm talking with Joanna Meyer, the author of the recently released book, Women, Work, and Calling. And no matter what title you have or don't have, we are all working women. People, tasks, and schedules fill our days, and we all have influence in these spheres. How do you respond to God's calling? How does God grow our soul through our work? And how do we tap into our vocational power? Well, that's where we're headed today. So, though women now have professional opportunities beyond what previous generations ever imagined, the church's vision for women's work has not always grown with us. Joanna Meyer addresses this gap in women's discipleship, providing a theological framework for women's work and influence and offering resources for the challenges of working life. Joanna is Director of Public Engagement at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, where she leads public events, hosts the Faith and Work podcast, and she founded Women, Work, and Calling, a national initiative that equips Christian women for godly influence in public life. Enjoy my conversation with Joanna. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, it's a gift to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, well, we're celebrating the semi-recent release of your book, and it's also the name of your initiative. We'll get to that in a moment. But I wanted to start a little personally, because in some ways we're just women making our way in life. And I want to just start there and just hear a little bit about your own relationship with God. And then how over the course of time did that begin to really inform the way you work? It's a beautiful flow. Love to hear.
It really flows from a combination of my own personal journey related to marriage and motherhood, as well as kind of a theological journey as my theology grew and expanded to have a broader vision of the world. It really shaped how I think about work. But since I was a little kid, I've always been fascinated by the social studies, how people experience the major events that make our world, how cultures are formed. And so as my faith grew through my teenage years, it began to shape how I thought about social studies. I wanted to be a high school teacher. And so I envisioned teaching kids about history. In the midst of that, I was fascinated about how God had worked through history. And so I wanted to know, what were these major world events that shaped why we believe the things that we do as Christians? How was faith a part of why the Gothic cathedrals of Europe look the way they do, or why art in Japan looks the way it does. And so it was this unique process of me beginning to think about how faith informs culture. And I happened to be worshiping at churches that were sound doctrinally, and they also had a big view of the gospel. And by big, what I mean is this idea that the gospel is Christ at work in every corner of the created world. And I realized that, the implications of what Christ did on the cross extend to every area of life. And so, yes, it does speak into things like art or the sciences or our experience of what a neighborhood or city looks like. And that just sparked my imagination for thinking about faith at work in the world. And I didn't quite know what to do with it. I worked in campus ministry for 12 years right out of college and loved that experience. It was an absolute treasure to see people discover Christ for the first time and learn to walk maturely with him. But I also struggled after our students graduated because I didn't feel like we were preparing them adequately for the realities of the world that they would face. We were teaching them how to replicate what we were doing in campus ministry, but it didn't speak at all to their lives as neighbors or citizens or employees. And so that was lingering in my life as an area of discomfort as I transitioned out of campus ministry. I had this growing vision of the gospel. And I started working on a master's at a Christian business school, and they had us take a theology of work class. I was working in the corporate sector at the time, so I was really getting a clear-eyed view of what work in a business looked like. And then I took this theology of work class, and it was like a framework just snapped into place in my life. I began to understand that work is one of those foundational themes that we see throughout Scripture. And I realized how few people had ever had this integrated vision of God at work in them and through them in the context of their work. And so that was the undercurrent that was going on. I was starting to teach about faith and work at my local church as 10 years ago, the Denver Institute for Faith and Work got founded. And wouldn't you know, all those pieces in my life were starting to come together, and I could be employed doing this, which is just amazing. So that's what was happening theologically for me. And then personally, I happen to be single and I'm in my 40s. And so as I moved through my 30s, I was looking for a broader story in which to frame my life, because I wasn't checking the traditional boxes of marriage and motherhood. I still am not a mom. I'm no longer able to have kids. And you would laugh because in high school, my girlfriends thought I would be the first one to get married, and I'm the last one of all of them. And so I needed a guiding framework that looked like it fit the reality of my life. And so much of my experience as a Christian woman revolved around the assumption that marriage and motherhood would be the central focus of our lives. And so this combination of thinking broadly about the gospel, gaining a vision for work, and then seeing a need for broader discipleship as a result of my own experience really galvanized me to start thinking about what whole life discipleship looks like for Christian women. And that in no way diminishes the importance of marriage and motherhood. It simply broadens the frame so that we have an integrated vision of all the roles and responsibilities that we have. And we also have a vision that empowers and speaks into the fullness of a woman's life. So all of our professional gifts, our ambitions, our drives are meaningful to God and something that he can shape and use for his purposes. So for someone like me who has leadership gifts, I needed that broader framework, and I needed a compelling mission that would drive my life forward in spite of whatever my life stage was.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that with us. And I can speak, I am married with children, but I still resonate with this connection with God that gave me a broader view of my life and the world around me. And even within the context in which I find myself, I have still had that desire, as you have shared, to find my way into what God has for me, or what he has for me in who I am, the gifts he's given, and the way he wants me to express those. And so I think even for wherever a woman finds herself, I still think that's a valid conversation and a part of finding our own calling, right?
It's a compelling vision for men and women of any life stage. When you talk about discipleship, it's an integrated vision of life in which we live with God and for him in all things. And I just think it's unfortunate because in a lot of circles for Christian women's ministry, we tend to teach a compartmentalized model where we'll focus on important things like how to understand scripture and make it a source of nourishment and growth, or how to enrich our relationships. Those are important. They're just not the whole story. And so we need something that is just broader and that it can fit all of us.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited then to dig further into this because I'm assuming these are some of the things that you're talking about in your book and what you do here.
There will be women who are listening, I can guarantee, who are like, no one has ever told me this before.
I know. Oh, yeah. Well, I can't wait to hear that then. There is something you said about your book. You said it presents daily work as a place for both intimacy with God and redemptive influence in public life. I love that sentence. So would you just begin to unpack that vision?
This begins with finding our individual lives in the grand story or narrative arc of Scripture. And so when we think of intimacy with the Lord, we begin to ask, what were we made for? And how do we relate to the Lord in that? You see that in the opening chapters of Genesis, where we're made in God's image, meaning that every day we're a reflection of him. So there's a degree of intimacy there. You know, we are his model and expression in the created world. And so that suggests intimacy. We also are given those marching orders of work in the opening chapters of Genesis. That idea that men and women are called together into the stewardship and care and productivity of the created world. You realize when we experience God, before sin came into the world in an ideal state, we were being productive. We were working together and with God. So intimacy is there from the very beginning. And then we think about redemptive influence. We think forward in the Bible to the death and resurrection of Christ. And we say, well, what is the fruit of that world-changing action? It's that Christ is beginning a process of renewing, of redeeming any area of life that has been distorted or damaged by sin. And so that means wherever we go, we will see things that maybe aren't the way that God intends them to be. or we'll see opportunities for God's goodness, his beauty, his truth to be amplified in that place. Whether you are teaching in a public school classroom, whether you are founding a business, whether you are flying a plane filled with passengers for Southwest Airlines, there's opportunities for you to be restoring what's broken or amplifying the goodness and attributes of God. And so understanding that our work is part of that process of Christ renewing all things means that we can exert godly influence wherever we are. And that sparks our imagination to say, how will God work uniquely through me in this place? Because you may be the only person that's in that place with a godly perspective and the opportunity to exert gospel influence there.
Yeah, I think it's important for us not to think there are only certain people that can do certain kinds of whatever God's work is, right? Whether you have a title of pastor or missionary, or I don't even know what the titles are that we would come up with, but it's someone else will do that. I recently attended a business conference in the Midwest, and there was a guy there who has a ministry called 94X. And that's because he's determined that statistically people are at work 94 times as long as they are at church.
Yes.
And so he was
with God.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. People live their actual lives out there doing their thing. And how wonderful to be reminded that our calling goes with us into all those places. It's not relegated off to just those with a specific title.
And it affirms the giftedness of every person that follows Christ. I want the listeners to hear that. It means that every single one of us has a unique place in which we serve. We have unique gifts, we have unique temperaments, and all of that goes together in living with God and for his purposes in the world. And so we want to affirm that. We want to disciple people towards that because that's part of God's work in the world. Why wouldn't we want to have that be part of the conversation of growing to maturity as a follower of Christ?
Completely. Well, I'm wondering then, would you share with us, how does God grow our souls through our work?
Yeah, this is such an important question because it would be tempting to try and leave our soul at the door and not realize that one of the most profound places that we have for God to shape our lives and our souls is through our work. If you think about, just like you said, the amount of time we spend there, but also think about the pressures that you experience at work. You may have performance pressure, anxiety, and fear. You may have an obsession or idolatry with work. Work can very easily become an idol. You have interpersonal conflict. You have frustration, all of that. In Genesis 3 is when sin enters the world and frustration with work begins. Like it says that the soil will bear thistles and thorns for Adam and Eve. And you realize like, oh, that idealized vision of work is not happening anymore. Right. And so we realize that as we are in that environment, the Lord can use that to mature our character, to push us in surrender towards greater dependence on him. Did I say recognize sin in our life? Definitely recognize sin. There's so many ways that work is a real catalyst for highlighting our need for growth. And also, it's an opportunity for us to invite the Lord in that we would begin to experience him in those critical moments of pressure at work. So he definitely uses work to shape our souls.
Yeah. I like what you're circling around here. I think maybe it's the idea of integration.
Yeah.
I mean, I am me wherever I go, whoever I'm with. And so this is the common denominator right here, and Christ in me. Yep. And so where I go, I get to express that. And I think you're encouraging us to really be mindful of that.
Yeah. And this is especially important for Christian women to hear, because depending on your background, and I want to be careful because a woman's journey is as unique as her particular story, the place she grew up, her family dynamics, her church denomination. But this idea of integration as it relates to work and calling is so important because we've often elevated certain compartments of our life. But when you hold together both our relational commitments, our roles in public life, it begins to be a question of stewardship, of saying, God, how will you help me honor the sometimes conflicting roles and responsibilities that I have? How will you help me integrate them so I'm carrying them all together before you? That's a much more healthy way to live. And I think it's a much more impactful way to live too.
Yeah. I feel like right now I want to insert just a little bit of a personal story and maybe have you respond or interact with me about it. I came to this version of my vocational life in my 50s. So my husband and I started Unhurried Living. I was about 52.
Mm.
We're coming up on 9 years. And before that, of course, I've had different jobs all throughout my life, which we won't go into. But I wanted to talk about this specific season because it came upon me sort of after the kids are grown. I'm in my 50s. There's for me, it was a season of feeling like a different kind of freedom and a doorway opening up to maybe what the vibrancy of the second half of life could be. So fortunately for me, I had been tending my relationship with God and continuing to being formed over the course of time. So when I hit my 50s, I was ready for what was to come. So that is nothing but grace, and I'm supremely grateful. But it's been an interesting journey in these last 9-ish years to go through all of those things that you're talking about, to be able to express what God has given through here. But I ran into my perfectionism. I ran into my ambition. I exhausted myself. At one point, I even drove myself to what my therapist called a quasi-anxiety attack because of when you're building something from, quote, nothing, it's hard work.
Yes.
Right.
Hear ya.
And so at my best, what I hope to be doing is offering everything that God has given or poured into me, come into my life. And now I'm trying to express that in my work. And at the same time, I'm getting exhausted or I'm getting anxious or, all the things, trying this and that's not working. And, let's not do this. So there are multiple stories, of course, of how God has grown my soul. But most recently, what I'm finding is that all the engines that I've tried, ambition, perfectionism, anxiety, obviously don't work long term. But I'm a slow learner, so I've gone through every one of them in its own cycle. And I finally hit in this last year where I got so tired that I had to choose to give those up. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I could not even choose to give them up. I can't function that way anymore. Yeah. And so now I'm finding myself in a transitionary moment of, instead of anxiety compels me, where is that the love of Christ compels me?
Oh yeah.
Right.
I've been meditating on Matthew 11:28 and to 30, where Christ offers this invitation to me, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. But he uses that specific phrase, take my yoke upon you. And we often will stop in teaching that verse and we think of it as, we'll say, what's a yoke? It's something that unites two animals together. It's an agricultural implement. But I think what we forget is that that's an implement of work. That when Christ says, come, take my yoke upon me and learn from me, he's really talking about learning in the process of doing work. And I think the metaphor, extends to all of life. But so often I treated that like in my campus ministry days, especially, I would overwork and get exhausted. And then I would flee to Jesus and I would have relief and experience grace. And then I would go back to my patterns of overwork. And I remember even saying I'm having such a hard time getting grace to stick. I keep, forgetting about it and I get exhausted and I have to go back and find it and rediscover it. And what I had failed to understand was this integrated vision of life with Christ. And so he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. We are working alongside Jesus, and that makes our workplace a place of vocational discipleship. And that is it elevates the value of work. And it also allows us to live intimately with the Lord in every moment.
Yeah, I'd love for you to go further into this too, because you have a section on rest. And of course, at Unhurried Living, this is what we teach. So I just told on myself, which is what I do often anyway. But in the midst of that, I actually was leaning into all the practices that I teach. And yet I still found myself on the other end of anxiety, just because. All that to say, rest is central. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do we lean into God's gift of rest? And in the midst of our vocational life, what does that process look like?
It's helpful to understand that work and rest go hand in hand, that rest is not intended as an escape from the badness of work, but it's a complement to work, that they coexist and they both need each other, because the Bible talks about not being lazy too. So it's that beautiful sense of like stepping into the fullness and goodness and brokenness of work, and also understanding that to really thrive and survive in that environment, we need the beauty of God-given rest. And so an intentional pattern of Sabbath, and that can take a lot of different forms, is vital. And I think people that are intentional about rest, managing the way that work can creep into every area of life, and I think managing the role that technology plays in our lives, are two critical factors to be able to experience things like silence and solitude, or the creativity that comes from being unplugged from the demands of daily life. So it's a beautiful complement rather than an escape.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful way of looking. It's not just work, 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 collapse, and then call that rest. It's actually a vibrant engagement. So I wonder, can you talk a little bit more about that for yourself? What does it look like for practices or what's in your toolbox?
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because, this fall, in about 10 days, I'm launching my book on the world and leading a national event for women. And so I had to look at it, and I said this to my team. I said, for about 5 weeks, I will be overworking. I'll be hustling. It's going to be a joyous hustle because I'm leaning into the gift of what God is doing in my life and through my life. And I know it's not sustainable. I know that this will not be the way I want to live long-term, but I just had to acknowledge, like, for a season, it's just going to be what it is. And that was helpful to understand the ebb and flow of the seasons, and also to understand that there's got to be a limit. I can't live like that. So when I'm at my best, what rest would look like would often be, for me, a Saturday Sabbath. People sometimes have strong opinions about Sabbath being a day in which worship is involved, but I tend to feel like I'm showing up and on when I'm at church on Sundays. And so it isn't always a restful place for me. And so for me, I'm blessed by having a team where we are encouraged to take a Sabbath, and we'll identify which day of the weekend is your Sabbath, and you are not expected to be taking phone calls or answering emails. Like, we want to know that you're resting. So I've chosen Saturdays. And often I think the biggest thing is managing technology in my life, not waking up and just constantly being on. And I also have to ask myself, am I planning for that break so that it would be restorative, or am I just kind of sliding face first into a Sabbath day? I often feel that way when I go into vacation. It's like sliding face first into home plate. I just barely make it. And I think a good Sabbath isn't one that you go crawling into exhausted. It's one that you've anticipated and you maybe have planned for. And you've thought about what will you be taking out of your life during that time, and also what will you be adding in. I appreciate what Tim Keller has written. He describes the benefit of doing something that brings joy or is avocational on your Sabbath, meaning, like, if you have a certain type of work, that you would do the opposite of that on your Sabbath days. Like, if you have a job where you're mostly like thinky talky, like my job, or staring at a computer screen, doing something with my hands that's physical. Maybe it's a craft. He recommended woodworking, but there are all kinds of things that you can do that help. If your life gets a little deformed by your work, it helps form it back into kind of who God has made you to be.
Yes, I've heard that before too. I love that advice. So you Sabbath with your hands if you're more of a peer, and if you're more of a worker with this, you can have other ways of Sabbathing. I love that. Go ahead.
It's interesting to ask really specifically, like, how does your work deform you?
Oh,
at the end of a work week, or when you reach that point of exhaustion, like literally physically what's going on with your body, but also spiritually, mentally, relationally, like what is not reflective of who God has made you to be and what you are at your best and rested. And that can help you identify what needs to happen to bring you back into a healthy, reformed place.
I love that question. I've never thought of asking it in that way. I usually talk about being formed, but deformed. What a beautiful question. Thank you for that. And what I'm hearing you too is I'm hearing you talk about intentionality and also just being conscious, right? I have 5 weeks. They're going to be crazy. Some of us just live that way ongoing, but you're conscious enough to identify what is occurring, and you don't want that to keep going after the 5 weeks is up, right? So there's a conscious choice here and a paying attention to what's going on. And I think that is a big part of our souls being formed in the midst of our work, making those kinds of decisions and then enacting boundaries as needed.
And it also asks us to be students of our own context. And by that, I mean understanding what the dynamics are in your daily work. So it may be certain team dynamics that are really hard for you that may have that deforming effect on your soul. You're like, I know by the end of the week, I'm acting a certain way because I've been pressured this way. Or certain industries, actually, not just certain, every industry has its own tendencies. And so understanding what it is about your field of work that isn't good for your soul or isn't the way God intends it to be, it allows you to really work both in a positive way to have a godly influence there, but also to understand what it's probably doing to you. So maybe you're a medical resident and you're dealing with extreme overwork and lack of sleep, or you're dealing with the arrogance of the doctors that you're working for. And you know that that's your unique context. That's a place for you to use wisdom about how to both influence and also for God to restore and renew you there. Another would be if you're a lawyer. I have a number of friends that are really, really unhappy lawyers because of the pressures of both law school and then the early days of before they become partners. You're kind of an indentured servant to your law firm until you reach that level. And that has a huge effect on your life. And the pressure to meet your billable hours for the year in order to get your bonus. That's a value of your industry that can have a deforming effect on your soul.
Thank you for sharing that too. I'm wondering, you share the idea of vocational power. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what is that? How do we tap into that? What do we do? Yeah.
Yeah, it was so fun. At last year's Women Work and Calling annual event, we had a session on how do we think redemptively about power? And I had never heard that discussed at a Christian women's event before. Often we're told to what power we can't have in faith communities. And what I mean by that is that if we see our work, our whole life response to God's call as a place for gospel influence, meaning joining Christ in the renewal of all things, we better know the tools that he has given us to be agents of renewal, right? That's power. Every single one of us has it to greater or lesser degrees, but we all have some measure of ability to influence. And if we're going to be effective in becoming an agent of flourishing, I love the author Amy Sherman uses that term. Every person who follows Christ can be an agent of flourishing.
Beautiful.
You need to know what those tools are. And so in Amy's books, both her new book, Agents of Flourishing, and her original one called Kingdom Calling, Vocational Stewardship for the Common Good, that's the subtitle. She identifies areas of vocational power and invites her readers to identify what the unique mix is that they have. And so examples of that might be your platform or reputation is a form of power, that people look to you as a source of wisdom or influence. It could be a more obvious one, like wealth is a form of power. Maybe you're the most relationally networked person in your neighborhood. That's a form of power because you're able to influence people. I think of my own life. I have lived in the Denver area off and on for 30 plus years. And so I work for a nonprofit. I don't have a lot of financial capital, but boy, I have a lot of relational capital because I've intentionally built that relational network. And so that's power. That's ability to call on those relationships for collaboration, for help, for resources that you need. That is power. And so part of living as those agents of renewal is knowing where God has put you and what the pressures and temptations and opportunities for influence are in that place, and then understanding the tools that he has given you to use in that way. And I think that's critical for Christian women. That's why I talk about whole life discipleship, because I'm like, why in the world are we not empowering Christian women to have the kind of godly influence God has equipped them to have in the places that they are?
Yeah. Well, what would you suggest for a woman who's just hearing the term vocational power for the first time? And what if she wanted to lean into that and go, well, that's interesting. What might she do?
Yeah.
Like to lean into that for herself?
Yeah. I think becoming a student of your own life and saying, where do I have influence that I maybe have not recognized before? And it could be a subtle thing. Even if you are a person who's for a season at home and focused on your family and homemaking, you still have influence. You are present in your neighborhood. You're present in your community. You're present at your kids' soccer games. And so you would begin to use that lens of like, hey, what might God be at work what might he be doing in the situation? And then who am I? Like, who has God made me to be here? And then you begin to tease it out. Maybe you have a greater vision of civility on the sidelines at your kid's soccer game.
Yeah.
Maybe the most painful, strained thing in your community is that parents and grandparents behave badly and yell at refs at the soccer game. And so you begin to say, these relationships in our neighborhood, in our community matter to God. And so what are some steps that we can take? What are the issues that are making us behave so badly towards each other? And what are steps we can take to renew and restore these relationships? So that's a really simple model where maybe a parent who's at a soccer game can begin to understand what influence they have in that setting. I just pulled that out of the top of my head.
Yeah, thank you. Love it.
I want to make it daily, for someone that doesn't have, somebody isn't a lawyer.
Right. Yeah. All of what you're saying, I think, works for any of the women who are listening who find themselves anywhere. And I want to stop inside of this conversation actually and talk for a minute just about finding that confidence. We talked about this just for a second before I pressed record. The magical mystery of figuring out how to walk in confidence as a woman in this world, offering what she has. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh,
getting in touch with that and walking in it.
Right? Yeah. Here's True Confessions. Hi, listeners. I'm looking at you on the YouTube. Hi, True Confessions. So I have a lot of influence and opportunity in my role right now. And you would see me hosting a podcast or leading an event, and you would think, gosh, how does she get so confident? And the reality is I struggle with all kinds of forms of doubt about myself or lack of confidence every day. So in my book, Women Work and Calling, one entire section 3 or section 2 and 3 kind of touch on what are some of those challenges that women face that erode our confidence. It could be something like imposter syndrome, where you think, I'm not qualified to be here. I don't measure up to the other people in this space. And I'll let you in on a secret. Most of the heroes of scripture dealt with imposter syndrome, that sense of like, who am I to be here? Or they were punching above their weight, to use a boxing metaphor, where they were outclassed and outskilled. But God was at work in them. And so that's an example. I'm speaking to a group of very influential women on Friday, and I feel like I'm the smallest professional in the room. And I keep thinking, who are they to listen to me? And so that's an example of my own life. Other things are limiting beliefs you may have about yourself, and beginning to know how to identify them and respond to them, meet them with gospel truths is a big part of that process. But it's real. Or even a hesitancy to toot our own horn. And that has professional implications when women don't know how to articulate clearly and empathically the actual effectiveness and proven results that they are having. That keeps us from getting promoted, or it limits the opportunities that we have at work simply because we aren't reflecting ourselves accurately. And so we have to begin to dig below the surface a little bit and figure out, okay, what are the unique ways that I'm struggling with confidence? And also, where do I need to grow in this? Like, what does a fully authentic and yet confident me look like?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I've noticed in my own life that that's definitely been a process of just one step at a time, taking chances. And sometimes what has happened is kind of a combination of maybe naivete paired with the fact that I really want to help people. And so there have been just times where I have stepped forward, even in spite of that imposter syndrome. So I think sometimes that's a good encouragement too, is you can't wait until it's all put together. The entire time I've been doing what I've been doing for the last 9 years, there's been that little voice in the back of your mind, any one of the 3 that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And yet I've continued to move forward. And sometimes it's just taking that next step. What can I do next? What is rising up from within me that must be shared so that someone is encouraged or helped? I just follow that trail and do my best to not shove aside those voices, but to acknowledge them. We're going to work with all those parts, and then I've watched confidence just grow little by little by little, because then I have more and more experience that backs up the fact that I can do that. Right.
You can do that. And trusted friends are a huge help. I
Yeah.
think one of the gifts in my life is that I've cultivated relationships with mature female friends who've been in my life for years, and they love me enough to be honest with me. And so when I have doubt, they literally will say, you can do that. Or like, do you see what you're doing? Like you need that supportive and honest voice to be part of that journey with you, to really step into all that God has made you to be. Because goodness, tagline at Women Weren't Calling is the world needs who God has made you to be. And it's so true.
Yes. I could not believe that more, especially in this current season. That is something that I think about a lot, actually. Dallas Willard has this thing that he said that I don't know if I can quote it exactly right now, but he's basically saying all the church needs to fulfill Christ's purpose on earth is the quality of life he makes real in the life of his disciples.
Yes.
I think I almost said it perfectly because I've been saying it so much.
I was looking at a Willard quote this morning, and this, I think it's, okay, humor me, everybody. I'm going to see if I can look it up, because I think I may have been looking at the same quote, which would just be kind of crazy. So we'll keep talking, and I'll just...
Yes, you keep looking for it. But he's basically saying to start a sentence so boldly, all the church needs to fulfill Christ's purpose on earth. They're like, what's the second half of that sentence? And he's basically saying the quality of life that is being made real in me and that being shared with others, that would make a difference. I believe that.
Yeah. And Willard often talked about work. That's one of the things I've appreciated about him so much, is that he talks about work as a place of discipleship. We learn from Jesus how he would do our work in our place. Yes. And that's gift.
I love that. Did you find?
No, I'll find it and stick to you in the show notes.
Yeah, I think it's probably the same quote. We can look it up. Yeah. So I love the fact that you touched on relationships. It's good to have people in our lives who can speak to us when we're either too high or too low, right? To bring us down or to lift us up. And so having a connection like that is wonderful.
Can I read you the quote? I found it.
Oh, good. Yes.
Thanks for humoring me. So this may be different than yours, but it's a good one. He said, the greatest issue facing the world today with all its heartbreaking needs is whether those who by profession or culture are identified as Christians will become disciples. And by that he means students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus, steadily learning from him how to live the life of the kingdom of the heavens into every corner of human existence.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
it's good.
We learn how to be Jesus in the context that we are.
I could not agree more. I think it's as simple as that, right? It's hard to be me, but I think the actual invitation is not that hard, and we complicate it in so many ways when in fact we're invited. The invitation at the very beginning of my journey with God was a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Do you remember that phrase?
Yes.
I answered, I was like, yes. And then somehow over the course of time, I added a bunch of things, but I think that's still the invitation, this relationship, and I am being formed, and then I share with people and events, all that goodness as best as I know how. There's a simplicity to that. And if we all did that with, in our own way, I think a lot of things would change. Don't you?
And I often describe this paradoxical relationship between intimacy and immensity, that the gospel is deep enough to the core of who we are that it meets our deepest individual need. But the gospel is as broad as the needs of the world. Mm-hmm. And so when we give our lives to Christ, it's almost like we just got a little conveyor belt that's just pulling us into mission. And his mission is the renewal of all things. And so who knows where that will lead or how he will work through us. And that's part of the adventure of calling.
Yeah, love it. I love this work that you're doing. I think I'm going to ask one more question before we move on. I'm wondering if you could talk about the spiritual and emotional strength that we need when we're seeking to thrive in our roles.
That's critical. And so some of the issues that we were talking about earlier about confidence, it flows from a deeper need of identity. Mm-hmm. We need to understand with clarity who we are in Christ and what that means in the context that we're in. I'm thinking of a friend of mine that's an accountant for a major corporation in town. She's a classic middle manager with a lot of responsibility. And she's had to walk away from 2 previous accounting jobs that pressured her to cook the books, to lie about the numbers that she was dealing with. And to me, that is an action that flows from emotional and spiritual health, of knowing with conviction what she would and wouldn't do, that her identity wasn't so tied up in a certain salary level or a certain company that she worked for, that when the need to be faithful and obedient to what God asked her to do came, she was able to respond. And so questions of identity are a big part of that. I think other ones are, how will we develop habits throughout the day that allow us to have a source of spiritual nourishment? And here at the Denver Institute, we've developed monthly patterns of spiritual disciplines that we've tailored to the workplace. And so an example of one that I really like is practicing a breath prayer in the context of your job, of knowing how to use that simple, breath prayer is just a simple phrase that you repeat through the inhale and the exhale of your breath. So something even as simple, I'm going to make this up, so it may not be very poetic, but Jesus Christ, thank you that you are present with me and faithful. It's not very articulate, but you could say, Lord Jesus Christ, on an inhale, and on an exhale, say, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's one of the classic phrases of the Christian faith. But something like that allows you to just settle into the presence of God in your workplace. Those are all examples of how some of the habits and disciplines that you may do at home or in your faith community actually are vital and relevant to the workplace.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for bringing up breath prayer. That's just one of the most easy in your pocket practices you can take literally anywhere and just make that connection. So thanks for that. Well, Joanna, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you'd want to say to us that I didn't ask. Is there something that's on your heart that how you'd like to encourage the women as they're moving forward here?
I think it's the beauty of calling and how expansive it is. We used that word integration earlier, which I think is so vital, of all of our lives being held together before the Lord. But I think calling is an expansive thing in the sense that God invites you to bring all that you are to all that he is doing in the world. And that's a powerful, terrifying, invigorating place to be. And I think depending on a woman's faith community or experience, she may not feel like all that she is valued and vital to the kingdom. And so just knowing that when you say yes to Jesus, you say yes to all that he is and all that he's doing in the world. And that is calling. If that's all you hear is that sense of invitation into God and his purposes, gosh, you have a really vibrant life ahead of you. And God has beautiful and painful and growing things in store.
Yes. And I love the phrase that you said quite a few times here. You said whole life response.
Yep.
I love those big, beautiful, bold invitations. So I'm wondering too, Joanna, just before we close, would you share with us ways we can be in touch with you to hear more about your book or your ministry online? Where are you?
I would love that. So an easy place to find me is at womenworkandcalling.com. And depending on when this episode airs, you can check out our annual event, which is November 4th. We host it in person in Denver, and also we live stream it around the world. So if you're in Timbuktu, you can probably find us. And that's all at the website. You can find my book at Amazon or your local bookseller. It's Women, Work, and Calling by Joanna Meyer. And I'm on all of the major social media platforms. So just kind of look for my name and my smiling face and you'll find me there.
I already found you on Instagram. So
that's fun. We got to be friends for our conversation, which was really fun.
I love that. Well, Joanna, I know there's so much more we could talk about, and we could have spent half an hour on any one of the questions that I raised, but at least we got a taste and see of the work that you're doing. And I love your passion and I love your gifts as I've seen them so far. And so I just pray God's great blessing on you and your work.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
Well, here's your I Can Do That for this week. Reflect on your own vocational calling. How might God want to grow your soul in the midst? Remember, this is an inside-out dynamic, a beautiful cycle of receiving from God and pouring out for the sake of others. Re-engage your thoughtful connection to this process. And remember, you're making your way forward one small, simple, and gracious step at a time.